The Holocaust, a name that reminds us of one of the darkest times in human history. It refers to the terrible actions of Nazi Germany from 1941 to 1945, when 6 million Jews and millions of others were persecuted and killed. To truly understand this horror, we need to look beyond the numbers and see how such evil came to be. This is the story of the Holocaust, a tragedy that changed history and affected humanity deeply. Before the Holocaust, Jewish communities were a part of many European societies, thriving and contributing to culture. But deep-rooted anti-Semitism, or hatred towards Jews, was always present. This harmful prejudice was used and increased in the 20th century, leading to a coordinated plan to exterminate an entire people. In 1933, Adolf Hitler's rise to power marked a crucial turning point for Germany, a nation reeling from the devastation of World War I and the punitive Treaty of Versailles. With millions impoverished and jobless, Hitler offered a vision of hope, promising to restore Germany's strength and identity. His rhetoric, appealing to national pride, resonated with a populace desperate for stability, but beneath this facade lay a radical ideology rooted in hate. As Hitler gained influence, he scapegoated various groups, labeling them as the cause of Germany's suffering. He proclaimed the superiority of the pure, Aryan race while branding Jews, Slavs, Roma, political dissidents, and LGBTQ individuals as subhuman. This propaganda was fueled by long-standing anti-Semitism, which Hitler amplified, portraying Jews as traitors responsible for the nation's economic and social crises. In 1933, the Nazis initiated a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses, leading to the systematic exclusion of Jews from society. Laws were enacted to dismiss Jewish civil servants and bar Jewish professionals from their occupations, aiming to isolate and strip Jewish communities of their rights. This campaign of exclusion expanded to include other groups deemed undesirable, such as the Roma and Slavs, as well as political opponents who faced brutal persecution. The Nazi regime engaged in a relentless propaganda campaign that dehumanized these groups, framing them as threats to the German way of life. This messaging permeated daily life, taught in schools and promoted in media, leading ordinary citizens to view Jews and marginalized groups as enemies. Society fractured, with neighbors turning against each other, and anti-Semitic violence and vandalism becoming commonplace. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws institutionalized racial discrimination, stripping Jews of citizenship and cutting them off from society. The regime fostered a climate of fear, encouraging citizens to report dissent and ensuring compliance through the Gestapo's surveillance. As Hitler's power solidified, policies grew harsher, leading to widespread violence against Jews and others labeled as inferior. Alongside this internal campaign, Hitler aimed to expand Germany through the doctrine of Lebensraum, asserting that territories in the East were rightfully German. This vision of racial hierarchy justified the displacement, enslavement, or extermination of those deemed unworthy. Under Hitler, Germany transformed into a state geared towards systematic discrimination and annihilation, setting the stage for genocide. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, marking the official start of World War II. This aggressive act shocked the world, defying international agreements and revealing Hitler's ambition to reshape Europe based on his vision of racial hierarchy. Within weeks, the Polish resistance was overwhelmed by the German Blitzkrieg, a brutal military strategy combining air raids and fast-moving ground forces. Polish cities were bombed indiscriminately, plunging the population into a terrifying new reality under Nazi rule, characterized by fear and repression. For Hitler, this war was not just territorial, it was a racial crusade. Poland's diverse communities, particularly its large Jewish population, became the first targets of his radical policies. Occupying forces quickly began their campaign of oppression, stripping Jewish citizens of their rights and seizing their properties. Over the following months, the Nazis issued decrees that systematically isolated Jews from society. One of their most oppressive tactics was the establishment of ghettos, enclosed areas where Jewish families were forced to live. This confinement aimed to strip them of their humanity and dignity. In Warsaw, over 400,000 Jews were crammed into a small ghetto, living in squalid conditions with minimal food, water, or sanitation. Disease thrived in these overcrowded spaces, and many succumbed to starvation and neglect. The Nazis imposed strict curfews and replaced names with numbers, further dehumanizing their victims. Despite these horrific conditions, many Jewish people in the ghettos organized schools and cultural activities, striving to maintain a sense of community. Some even formed resistance groups, risking their lives to fight back against their oppressors. Polish citizens also suffered under brutal occupation policies. The Nazis viewed them as racially inferior, executing intellectuals and anyone suspected of opposing their rule. Cultural institutions were destroyed to erase Polish identity, and thousands were sent to labor camps under harsh conditions. Hitler aimed to create Lebensraum, living space, for Germans, by subjugating or eliminating the local population. German settlers moved into abandoned homes, displacing Jews and Poles alike. This transformation required unprecedented violence, justified by extensive Nazi propaganda that dehumanized their victims. As the Nazis expanded their operations, they established more ghettos, concentration camps, and killing centers. The Holocaust began in earnest, with Poland at its epicenter. Under Nazi rule, life for Jews, Poles, Roma, and others was marked by relentless terror and brutality. The invasion of Poland not only started World War II but also unleashed the full force of Nazi ideology, escalating into a systematic campaign of racial purification, condemning millions based on ethnicity, religion, or heritage. For many victims, the horrors had only just begun, as Hitler's regime pursued its chilling vision with terrifying resolve. In 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union in a brutal military campaign that extended the Holocaust into Eastern Europe. Hitler aimed not just to conquer territory but to eradicate what he termed the Judeo-Bolshevik threat, linking Jews with communism. For the Nazis, this invasion represented an opportunity for Lebensraum, living space, for Germans, necessitating the subjugation or extermination of millions, including Jews, Slavs, Roma, and others deemed undesirable. As German forces advanced, special mobile killing squads known as Einsatzgruppen followed closely behind. Composed of SS officers and police, these units were tasked with implementing genocidal policies. Their mission was to eliminate Jews, Soviet political leaders, Roma, and anyone labeled as enemies of the state. From the outset, the Einsatzgruppen operated with brutal efficiency, rounding up Jewish communities and executing them in mass shootings. Victims were forced to dig their own graves before being shot, with these horrific acts often witnessed by local residents and documented in photographs. One of the most notorious massacres occurred at Babi Yar, near Kyiv, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days. After being deceived into gathering under the pretext of relocation, families were led to the ravine's edge and executed. This massacre symbolized the Einsatzgruppen's merciless campaign, which saw the systematic extermination of entire communities across the Soviet Union, particularly in Belarus and Ukraine. In the invasion's first months, the Einsatzgruppen had already killed hundreds of thousands. The genocide extended beyond Jewish populations to include Roma, disabled individuals, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents. By the end of their campaign, these squads had killed over 1 million people, exemplifying state-sponsored genocide. Despite their efforts to conceal these crimes, extensive documentation left by soldiers and local collaborators provided a grim record of the atrocities. Amidst this horror, acts of resistance emerged. Some villages hid Jewish families, while partisans launched guerrilla attacks against German forces. Although the risks were immense, these acts of defiance highlighted the enduring human spirit in the face of overwhelming oppression. The invasion of the Soviet Union marked a critical turning point in the Holocaust, transitioning from oppression to systematic, organized murder. The Einsatzgruppen's actions foreshadowed the final solution and the establishment of extermination camps like Auschwitz. This invasion was an opportunity for the Nazis to pursue their vision of racial purity, plunging millions into a nightmare of unimaginable cruelty that left a lasting scar on human history. The Eastern Front became a site of unprecedented suffering, revealing how easily the machinery of death could operate. The early massacres, carried out with guns and bullets, remind us that the Holocaust began not in gas chambers but in fields and ravines, where victims were stripped of their humanity and murdered for being who they were. By 1942, the Nazi regime had initiated a coordinated campaign to exterminate Europe's Jewish population, known as the Final Solution. This plan transformed into a continent-wide machinery of death, targeting not only Jews but also Roma, political dissidents, and other marginalized groups. Across Nazi-occupied Europe, families were uprooted, and communities that had thrived for centuries were erased overnight. Deportations were marked by profound suffering. Families were given mere minutes to gather their belongings before being forcibly removed from their homes. Under the watch of armed guards, they were packed into overcrowded cattle cars, often traveling for days without food or water. The stench of sweat, waste, and despair filled the air, and many perished en route, while those who survived arrived weak and traumatized. Upon arrival at death camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz, the nightmare deepened. Nazi guards forced prisoners from the trains, separating families based on arbitrary commands that determined who would live or die. At Auschwitz, new arrivals faced selection, where SS officers categorized them for forced labor or immediate execution in gas chambers disguised as showers. Zyklon B gas was deployed, killing hundreds at once in a meticulously calculated system of mass murder. Those selected for forced labor endured a different horror. Stripped of their identities, they were assigned numbers and forced into relentless cycles of labor under brutal conditions. Minimal food rations led to malnutrition and rampant disease, claiming countless lives. Camps like Treblinka and Sobibor were specifically designed for immediate extermination, operating gas chambers around the clock. From the moment of arrival, prisoners' lives were measured in minutes, with few surviving long enough to bear witness to the atrocities. Yet, amidst this horror, some preserved their humanity through small acts of kindness or by organizing resistance. A notable uprising in 1943 at Sobibor allowed several hundred prisoners to escape, though many were recaptured and killed. The camps aimed for total dehumanization, reducing individuals to mere numbers and erasing their identities. Families were shattered, communities obliterated, and rich cultural heritages nearly wiped from existence. For survivors, the trauma endured long after liberation, as they carried the memories of lost loved ones into a world struggling to comprehend the horror. These deportations and the systematic transport to death camps became defining aspects of the Holocaust. Each train station marked the end of a familiar world, while the final moments for many were spent in fear and isolation. Yet, their memory endures, reminding us of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience. In the early years of Nazi occupation, as systematic deportations swept through Europe, Jewish communities were uprooted and herded into ghettos and concentration camps. Cities like Kraków in Poland witnessed the rapid implementation of oppressive measures, and the Jewish population found itself facing a grim reality of segregation, starvation, and violence. During this period, an unlikely figure arrived in Kraków. Oskar Schindler, a businessman and a member of the Nazi Party, initially driven by the prospect of wartime profit. Schindler set up an enamelware and munitions factory known as Deutsche Emelwarenfabrik, or DEF, in Kraków, where he saw an opportunity to exploit cheap labor. Jewish workers, seen as expendable by the Nazi regime, were a cost-effective labor source. Schindler employed hundreds of Jewish laborers in his factory, seemingly indifferent to their plight. Yet, as he witnessed the brutality unfolding around him, friends and families torn apart, deportations leading to horrific fates, Schindler's attitude began to shift. The violence, the suffering of his workers, and the Nazi disregard for human life transformed his intentions, and he began to see his factory as a haven for those he employed. Forced labor. As Nazi policies escalated, so too did the demand for forced labor. Concentration camps expanded, and uncountable numbers were sent to work under extreme, dehumanizing conditions. Schindler, who had gained a reputation as a profitable and loyal German businessman, used his connections and financial resources to shield his workers from this fate. To Nazi officials, he portrayed his Jewish employees as essential to the war effort, arguing that they were skilled and indispensable for the factory's operations. But Schindler did more than just keep his employees on paper. He went to extraordinary lengths to ensure their safety, frequently bribing SS officers and other Nazi officials to keep his workers out of nearby camps. As the war raged on, he not only kept his workers fed and protected but treated them with an unprecedented level of humanity. He arranged for better food and more humane working conditions within his factory walls, despite the dire circumstances around them. In 1944, as the Nazi regime began closing down labor camps like the infamous Kraków Zoo camp, Schindler's workers faced an even greater threat of being deported to Auschwitz. Knowing the horrors awaiting him there, Schindler took the extraordinary and dangerous step of relocating his factory to Brunlitz in occupied Czechoslovakia. It was here that he compiled the now famous Schindler's List, naming nearly 1,200 Jewish men, women, and children whom he intended to save. This list represented lives, each name a person whom Schindler would personally spare from near certain death in the gas chambers. In Brunlitz, Schindler's factory became a refuge. His workers were shielded from the worst conditions of forced labor that others were enduring. Schindler, now deeply invested in his workers' well-being, even went so far as to sabotage his own production line, producing defective ammunition to subtly undermine the Nazi war effort. The operation was a costly one, draining Schindler's personal resources. Yet, he continued with unwavering resolve, exhausting his fortune to keep the factory running and his workers safe. When the war ended in 1945, Schindler had lost nearly everything. He was penniless, having spent his entire fortune on bribes, supplies, and operations to protect his workers. Though he escaped with his life, Schindler's actions went largely unrecognized in the immediate aftermath of the war. He lived in obscurity and hardship for many years, supported in part by the very survivors he had saved. Over time, however, the testimonies of the survivors, those on Schindler's List, brought his story to light. In 1963, he was honored by the State of Israel as Righteous Among the Nations, a title reserved for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Schindler's legacy, immortalized by the accounts of those he saved and later by the renowned film Schindler's List, became an enduring symbol of compassion and moral courage in the face of unfathomable cruelty. Today, Oskar Schindler's life serves as a testament to the power of an individual to make a profound difference, even amidst the darkest chapters of history. His bravery, though flawed and complex, shines as a beacon of hope and humanity. Schindler's story reminds us that courage can arise in unexpected places and that one person's determination to do good can impact generations. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, his name stands alongside those of survivors, celebrated as a protector, a hero, and a lasting inspiration in the annals of history. The Holocaust was not the work of a few. It required the participation of thousands across multiple layers of Nazi German society. From the infamous SS officers who carried out the atrocities in the camps to bureaucrats in government offices who issued orders and kept the machinery running, the Holocaust was an operation of horrifying scale and organization. It was a system where individuals, departments, and agencies collaborated with brutal efficiency to carry out the final solution. But the spectrum of responsibility did not end with the architects and enforcers of genocide. It extended to ordinary civilians, businessmen, and others who profited from the dispossession and annihilation of their neighbors. In this way, complicity spread through German society, transforming ordinary people into both witnesses and beneficiaries of one of history's greatest tragedies. At the center of this machinery stood the SS, a paramilitary organization sworn to Hitler and led by Heinrich Himmler. The SS was responsible for the concentration camps, the Einsatzgruppen killing squads, and the broader enforcement of Nazi racial policies. Its officers carried out these orders with a fervent loyalty to Nazi ideology, indoctrinated to believe that their actions served a higher purpose. They saw themselves as protectors of the Aryan race, following orders that justified, in their eyes, the murder of millions. The SS guards and officers who worked in the camps operated in a world where brutality became routine. They subjected prisoners to forced labor, starvation, and sadistic violence without hesitation, enforcing policies that stripped human beings of their dignity, freedom, and ultimately, their lives. Yet, the Holocaust was not only implemented by those who pulled the trigger or guarded the camps. Behind the front lines, countless individuals worked in offices, drafting and stamping documents that would seal the fate of entire families. High-ranking officials in the Nazi government, like Adolf Eichmann, coordinated the deportations, meticulously planning transport routes to ensure that Jews and other targeted groups were sent to their deaths efficiently. This bureaucratic involvement demonstrated how genocide could be carried out with a pen as much as with a gun. Accountants calculated the costs of deportations, statisticians documented population numbers, and logisticians organized train schedules. These actions might have seemed distant from the killing fields or gas chambers, but they were essential in ensuring that every step of the genocide proceeded with horrifying precision. The judicial system, too, played a critical role in legitimizing Nazi policies. Courts enacted laws that defined Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and other groups as undesirable, and stripped them of their rights. Legal professionals who should have protected civil liberties instead became instruments of oppression. Judges, lawyers, and police officers enforced discriminatory laws, seizing property and imprisoning people based on their ethnicity or beliefs. Such actions gave the Holocaust a veneer of legality, allowing many Germans to justify these atrocities as lawful measures for the so-called betterment of society. However, complicity extended beyond the obvious figures of authority. In cities and towns across Germany and occupied Europe, Many civilians played a part in the Holocaust, whether through active involvement, silent endorsement, or indirect benefit. Ordinary German citizens sometimes watched as Jewish families were forcibly removed from their homes, standing by in silence or even relief. Some took advantage of the situation, purchasing confiscated Jewish-owned businesses, property, and belongings at a fraction of their value. Houses, shops, and personal effects were redistributed to non-Jewish Germans, creating financial gain at the expense of their persecuted neighbors. The benefits of the Holocaust trickled down, implicating not only the architects of genocide but also ordinary people who profited from the devastation of Jewish lives. Some neighbors who had known each other for generations became informants, reporting Jewish families to the authorities or assisting in their arrests. Fear of retribution was a factor, but often prejudice or opportunism motivated these betrayals. People turned a blind eye to the suffering of others or rationalized their actions, convincing themselves that they were merely following orders or accepting what was, rightfully, theirs. In this way, ordinary citizens were woven into the Holocaust's fabric of complicity, becoming both passive witnesses and active participants. But there were also those who resisted, who refused to comply with Nazi orders or assist in the oppression. Some individuals risked their lives to hide Jewish families or provide aid to those in hiding. In Germany and across Europe, pockets of resistance and individuals of conscience refused to stand idle, choosing instead to defy a system built on hatred and dehumanization. However, these acts were rare and dangerous, and those who aided Jews did so at great personal risk. For every person who resisted, there were many more who chose the easier path of silence, benefiting from the suffering of others or simply doing nothing to stop it. The Holocaust's reach was so expansive because it relied not only on the fervent cruelty of fanatical SS officers but also on the passive acceptance and indirect support of ordinary people. It was a society-wide endeavor where cruelty, indifference, and complicity came together to facilitate genocide. This network of perpetrators and beneficiaries spread across Germany and occupied Europe, amplifying the tragedy and ensuring that the horror of the Holocaust extended far beyond the concentration camps. In the end, the Holocaust is a stark reminder that such atrocities are rarely the work of a few. They unfold with the participation, however passive, of entire societies, revealing the dark potential within human nature to become both the agents and beneficiaries of suffering. One of the brutal dimensions of the Holocaust was the forced labor imposed on millions of prisoners, Jews, political dissidents, Slavs, Roma, and others, who were viewed by the Nazis as expendable resources. Camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz became sites of unimaginable suffering and exploitation, where prisoners labored under inhumane conditions to support the Nazi war machine. The forced labor system was a deliberate strategy, reflecting the Nazis' belief that certain lives had no value beyond their utility to the state. Prisoners were treated as subhuman, forced to work until they collapsed from exhaustion or illness. Life in these camps involved daily battles against starvation, brutality, and the harsh elements. Prisoners endured freezing winters and scorching summers while being made to stand for hours during roll calls, followed by grueling tasks ranging from construction to factory work. Malnutrition was rampant, with meager rations providing insufficient calories for survival. Common illnesses like dysentery and tuberculosis spread unchecked, and those deemed unfit for labor faced either abandonment or execution. SS guards maintained a regime of terror, subjecting prisoners to beatings and arbitrary punishments for minor infractions, further breaking down solidarity among them. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Many prisoners were skilled professionals whose identities were stripped away, replaced by meaningless labor. They became faceless entities in a system designed to erase their individuality and humanity. The Nazis sought to break the spirits of prisoners as much as their bodies, compounding their suffering. Industries and businesses in Nazi Germany profited immensely from this system, with companies like IG Farben and Siemens exploiting camp labor to maintain production despite wartime labor shortages. This economic exploitation was intertwined with a broader ideological agenda that viewed undesirables as tools to be used and discarded. Jewish prisoners, in particular, were subjected to the most grueling forms of labor, an extension of anti-Semitic ideology aimed at total degradation before death. Despite the oppressive conditions, some prisoners resisted through acts of defiance, such as sabotaging machinery or working slowly to hinder production. Such acts were dangerous but represented a profound resilience and courage against overwhelming oppression, allowing prisoners to retain a sense of agency. The suffering of forced laborers persisted long after the war. Survivors were often left with physical scars from hard labor and disease, as well as deep psychological trauma from years of dehumanization. The Nazi forced labor camps served as instruments of ideological cruelty and economic gain, stripping individuals of dignity and identity. This dark chapter of history is a stark reminder of the depths of exploitation and inhumanity that can arise from prejudice and hate, alongside the remarkable resilience shown by those who endured it. In the final years of World War II, the tide turned against the Nazis as Allied forces advanced across Europe. Yet, as defeat loomed, the regime's brutality intensified. Determined to erase evidence of their atrocities, the Nazis hastily dismantled their network of concentration and extermination camps, initiating what became known as the Death Marches. These forced evacuations were a last, deadly assault on those who had survived years of starvation, disease, and violence. Weak from their suffering, prisoners were compelled to march through bitter winter nights across rugged terrain, enduring extreme conditions with little food or water. Guards showed no mercy. Anyone who stumbled was shot, and those who fell behind were left to die. In a cruel irony, liberation was near, yet countless lives were lost in these final days of Nazi cruelty. The marchers aimed to relocate prisoners to camps further from advancing Allied forces while eliminating witnesses to their crimes. Camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka were partially destroyed, and records were burned in a desperate attempt to cover up the genocide. However, the scars of brutality could not be hidden. For many prisoners, the marches extinguished any remaining hope. They walked through forests and towns, often passing civilians who looked away, unwilling to intervene. Hunger and exhaustion became unbearable, leading some to choose death over continued suffering. Others clung to life, supporting each other and sharing scraps of food. Amid the marches, some prisoners staged uprisings in a final act of defiance against the Nazis, reflecting their unbreakable spirit. Although these uprisings were often crushed, they showcased the humanity that the regime sought to erase. As Allied forces liberated towns and camps, they uncovered the horrific realities of the Holocaust. Soldiers were unprepared for the emaciated survivors and the piles of bodies that revealed the extent of Nazi atrocities. Images from camps like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen shocked the world, exposing the brutal truth of the genocide. By early 1945, as liberation spread, survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives from the wreckage of trauma. The end of the war brought freedom, but it could not undo years of suffering and loss. Survivors emerged as living testaments to the horrors they endured, carrying memories of those who had been obliterated. The death marches and the Nazis' frantic attempts to cover up their crimes reveal a regime clinging to its ideology of hate even as defeat was imminent. The resilience of survivors and the testimony of Allied soldiers ensure that the atrocities of the Holocaust will never be forgotten, serving as a powerful reminder of humanity's capacity to endure and resist against unimaginable evil. By 1945, the true scope of the Holocaust had become horrifyingly clear. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children had been murdered systematically in a campaign rooted in hatred and dehumanization. These 6 million were not just numbers but individuals, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, friends, and neighbors. Their lives were cut short in a crime unparalleled in scale and brutality, a systematic attempt to eradicate an entire people. This was genocide in its most horrifying form. A meticulously organized campaign where every element, from government propaganda to state infrastructure, worked together to annihilate a population simply because of who they were. But the tragedy did not end with Jewish lives. Millions of others were also swept into this machinery of death. The Nazis viewed the Roma people as racially inferior, leading to the near-total destruction of Roma communities across Europe. Tens of thousands of Roma men, women, and children were murdered in concentration camps, labor camps, and mass shootings. Their culture and heritage, vibrant and diverse, was nearly erased in the genocidal campaign known as the Porajmos, or the Devouring. The Holocaust also targeted people with disabilities. Those with physical or mental disabilities were deemed unworthy of life, under the Nazis' twisted ideology. Through the T4 program, named after the address of the Berlin building where it was administered, thousands of disabled individuals were murdered by lethal injection, starvation, or gas. These victims, often institutionalized and defenseless, were among the first to be systematically exterminated by the Nazi regime, marking a grim precursor to the larger genocide that would follow. Political dissidents, Polish and Soviet civilians, and those who dared to oppose Nazi rule became targets as well. Polish intellectuals, religious leaders, and members of the resistance were systematically eliminated in an attempt to weaken any potential opposition. On the Eastern Front, millions of Soviet prisoners of war were killed or left to die from starvation, disease, and exposure in camps. The Nazis' treatment of these groups reflected their broader contempt for anyone they deemed a threat to their vision of racial purity and dominance. LGBTQ individuals were yet another group swept into the tragedy. Homosexual men, in particular, were subject to brutal treatment, forced to wear pink triangles that marked them as degenerates in the Nazi hierarchy. Many were imprisoned, tortured, and experimented upon, suffering in ways that left scars long after the war. Those who survived faced continued discrimination and persecution, often denied recognition for the suffering they endured under Nazi rule. The sheer scale of death and suffering inflicted upon these millions defies comprehension. The numbers can feel abstract: 6 million Jews, thousands of Roma, hundreds of thousands of political dissidents, civilians, and marginalized groups. But behind every statistic is a human life, a story, a family that was forever changed. Communities were obliterated, family lines broken, and cultures decimated. Entire villages and neighborhoods, once full of life and laughter, were emptied, leaving silence and memories in their place. As we reflect on these staggering losses, we are reminded of the words of survivors and witnesses who bear testimony to the horror they endured. They speak not only to convey the depth of their suffering but also to ensure that the world does not forget. Memorials, museums, and gatherings across the globe serve as somber reminders of the Holocaust's victims. Places like Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin stand as testaments to the importance of memory. Candles are lit, names are read aloud, and moments of silence are observed in honor of those who were lost. The Holocaust remains one of the deadliest and most meticulously executed genocides in human history. It was a crime fueled by ideology, ignorance, and apathy, driven by those who viewed entire populations as less than human. This genocide left a scar on humanity, a reminder of how easily prejudice, when left unchecked, can spiral into unimaginable violence. The memory of the Holocaust compels us to confront hatred wherever it appears, to protect those who are vulnerable, and to honor those who were lost by ensuring that their stories are told. The 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, along with the millions of other victims, must never be forgotten. Their memory lives on as a testament to the consequences of unchecked hate and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of darkness. The death toll of the Holocaust is a stark reminder of what humanity must work tirelessly to prevent, a call to uphold justice and compassion, and to forever honor those who lost their lives in one of history's darkest chapters. When the Allied forces liberated the concentration camps in 1945, they uncovered horrors that defied human comprehension. Emaciated survivors, barely clinging to life, emerged from the barracks, their hollow eyes bearing witness to the years of starvation, suffering, and brutality they had endured. The scenes were harrowing: bodies piled high in mass graves, gas chambers with remnants of clothing, and personal items left behind, echoing with the silence of those who had perished. For the liberators, the sights and smells of these camps were an unimaginable revelation, shaking even the most battle-hardened soldiers to their core. Liberation was only the beginning of a long, painful process of healing for the survivors. Many had lost everything: their families, homes, communities, and even their health. While the world celebrated the end of the war, these survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding lives shattered by loss and trauma. Some found their way to displaced persons, DP, camps, where they would spend months or even years before finding new homes, often in unfamiliar countries. The DP camps became temporary communities, where survivors bonded over shared experiences and helped each other in the difficult journey toward healing. The enormity of the crimes committed during the Holocaust demanded justice. In November 1945, the Nuremberg trials began, marking the first time that an international tribunal held leaders accountable for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. High-ranking Nazi officials, including architects of the Holocaust like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess, stood trial. Evidence presented at Nuremberg included thousands of documents, photographs, and eyewitness testimonies, making the world confront the systematic nature of Nazi atrocities. Although some key figures were sentenced to death or imprisoned, many other perpetrators managed to evade justice, living out their days in secrecy or under new identities. The Nuremberg trials set a powerful precedent for international law, establishing that those responsible for atrocities would be held accountable, no matter their rank or position. Yet, justice was only a part of the legacy. For survivors, the trials were a reminder that their suffering had been acknowledged, and their voices had been heard on a global stage. The testimonies given during these trials became a cornerstone of Holocaust education, ensuring that future generations would understand the depths of this tragedy. In the years that followed, survivors played a crucial role in preserving the memory of the Holocaust. Some took up the painful task of sharing their stories with the world. Key rescuers and resistors. 1. Oskar Schindler. Initially a war profiteer and member of the Nazi Party, Oskar Schindler moved to Krakow to start an enamelware factory, employing Jewish workers as cheap labor. Over time, he became horrified by the Nazi brutality he witnessed and began using his position to protect his Jewish employees from deportation and death. By bribing officials and falsifying documents, he claimed his workers were essential to the war effort. In 1944, he compiled a list of nearly 1,200 Jews to relocate to a safer factory in Brunlitz, Czechoslovakia. His actions saved their lives, though he ended the war nearly bankrupt. Schindler was later recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem for his bravery. 2. Raoul Wallenberg. A Swedish diplomat in Nazi-occupied Hungary, Wallenberg issued thousands of protective passports, or Schutzpass, to Jews in Budapest, which identified them as Swedish citizens and shielded them from deportation. He also rented buildings to serve as safe houses under the protection of the Swedish flag, providing shelter to countless individuals. Wallenberg negotiated directly with SS officials, often risking his life to confront Nazis and demand that Jews be released. His efforts are estimated to have saved over 100,000 Jews. Tragically, he was detained by Soviet forces in 1945, and his fate remains unknown. 3. Irena Sendler. A Polish social worker, Sendler joined the Polish resistance and the Zygota, the Council for Aid to Jews, smuggling Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. Disguised as a health inspector, she forged documents and used creative methods, including hiding children in ambulances and toolboxes, to move them to safety. Sendler created an underground network of Polish families and orphanages willing to shelter the children. She meticulously recorded each child's true identity to reunite them with their families after the war. Captured and tortured by the Gestapo, she refused to reveal any information. Sendler ultimately saved around 2,500 children. 4. Chiune Sugihara. As a Japanese diplomat stationed in Lithuania, Sugihara defied his government's orders by issuing transit visas to Jews fleeing Nazi persecution, allowing them to escape through Japan. For nearly a month, he worked tirelessly, sometimes issuing over 300 visas a day and even writing them by hand after his office closed. Sugihara's actions saved around 6,000 Jews, but they came at great personal cost. After the war, he lost his diplomatic career and lived in relative obscurity. He was later recognized as righteous among the nations, and honored for his courage and humanity. 5. Sophie Scholl. A German student and co-founder of the White Rose Resistance Group, Sophie Scholl distributed pamphlets calling for non-violent resistance against the Nazi regime and an end to the mass murder of Jews. She, her brother Hans, and other members printed and distributed leaflets denouncing Hitler's crimes and advocating for moral responsibility. Scholl's bravery became a symbol of youthful resistance in Nazi Germany. She was arrested after distributing leaflets at her university, subjected to a show trial, and sentenced to death. Her courage and moral clarity remain inspirational to this day. 6. Janusz Korczak. A prominent Polish Jewish educator and pediatrician, Korczak ran an orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto. Known for his dedication to children, he refused offers of sanctuary, choosing instead to stay with the orphans he cared for. In August 1942, he and his children were transported to Treblinka extermination camp, where he and the orphans perished together. Korczak's legacy endures as a symbol of devotion and selflessness, and he is remembered for his pioneering ideas on children's rights and educational philosophy. Key victims and witnesses. 1. Anne Frank. A young Jewish girl who went into hiding with her family in Amsterdam in 1942, Anne Frank kept a diary chronicling her experiences, thoughts, and dreams. Her writings give an intimate view of a young girl's life under constant threat of discovery. Anne and her family were eventually betrayed, deported, and sent to Auschwitz and later Bergen-Belsen, where she died in early 1945. Her diary was published posthumously and became a globally significant testimony to the horrors of the Holocaust, representing the voice of millions of silenced children. 2. Elie Wiesel, a Romanian-born Jew, Wiesel was deported to Auschwitz at age 15 along with his family. He survived the death camps of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, where he endured forced labor, starvation, and the loss of his parents and sister. After the war, Wiesel became a writer, giving voice to survivors' experiences through his works, most notably Night, a harrowing account of his ordeal. Wiesel's writings and lectures on the Holocaust made him a powerful advocate for remembrance, peace, and human rights, earning him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986. 3. Primo Levi, an Italian chemist and Holocaust survivor, Levi was arrested as a member of the Italian resistance and sent to Auschwitz in 1944. His memoir, If This Is a Man, also known as Survival in Auschwitz, examines the dehumanizing conditions of camp life and explores the moral challenges faced by prisoners. Levi's clear-eyed, reflective prose offers profound insights into survival, identity, and humanity's darkest impulses. He continued writing on these themes, becoming one of the most influential voices on Holocaust memory. 4. Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian and leader in the Warsaw Ghetto, Ringelblum organized the Oneg Shabbat archive, a clandestine effort to document daily life under Nazi rule. Under Ringelblum's leadership, the archive preserved thousands of first-hand accounts, reports, and artifacts, giving an invaluable record of Jewish resilience and suffering. He and his family were eventually discovered and killed by the Nazis, but the archive was buried in milk cans and tins, later uncovered after the war and serving as a critical historical resource. 5. Simon Wiesenthal, an Austrian Jewish Holocaust survivor, Wiesenthal lost numerous family members in the camps and vowed to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. After the war, he dedicated his life to tracking down fugitives, notably contributing to the capture of Adolf Eichmann. Wiesenthal founded the Simon Wiesenthal Center, an organization dedicated to Holocaust memory, human rights, and combating anti-Semitism, and his work remains influential in the fight for justice and historical accountability. Key perpetrators. 1. Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Nazi Germany and architect of the final solution. Hitler's ideology of racial purity and anti-Semitism underpinned the Holocaust. His policies led to the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of other persecuted groups. Hitler's leadership transformed Germany into a totalitarian state, enforcing discriminatory laws, inciting racial violence, and orchestrating a campaign of genocide that reshaped history. 2. Heinrich Himmler. As head of the SS and overseer of the final solution, Himmler was instrumental in establishing concentration camps and organizing mass killings. His bureaucratic efficiency and commitment to Nazi ideology made him one of the most powerful and feared men in Nazi Germany. Himmler oversaw the SS's extermination campaign, from ghettos and forced labor to death camps, making him a central figure in the Holocaust. 3. Joseph Goebbels. Hitler's minister of propaganda, Goebbels spread anti-Semitic ideology and justified the regime's actions. His skillful use of media and propaganda techniques molded public opinion, inciting hatred and promoting Nazi beliefs. Goebbels also played a role in intensifying the final solution and promoting the regime's goals, fostering an environment that enabled the Holocaust. 4. Adolf Eichmann, a senior SS officer responsible for coordinating the logistics of the Holocaust, Eichmann organized mass deportations of Jews to ghettos and extermination camps. His meticulous work in transportation made him critical to the Nazi machine. After the war, he escaped to Argentina but was captured by Israeli agents in 1960, tried, and executed for his role in the genocide. 5. Joseph Mengele. Known as the Angel of Death at Auschwitz, Mengele conducted medical experiments on inmates, especially twins, often with lethal outcomes. His experiments involved brutal, unethical procedures, including forced sterilizations and surgeries without anesthesia. Mengele's actions epitomized the cruel pseudo-science used to justify Nazi ideology. Key international figures. 1. Franklin D. Roosevelt. As U.S. President, Roosevelt's responses to the Holocaust have sparked much debate. While the U.S. joined the Allies to fight Nazi Germany, America's restrictive immigration policies prevented many Jewish refugees from finding sanctuary. Roosevelt's administration, however, took action in 1944 by establishing the War Refugee Board, which helped save around 200,000 Jews in occupied Europe. 2. Pope Pius XII. The wartime pope's role remains controversial. While he helped establish aid networks for some refugees, critics argue he did not publicly condemn Nazi atrocities. Pius maintained a policy of neutrality, leading to polarized views on his role in the Holocaust, with some asserting he covertly supported Jews and others accusing him of failing to use his influence. 3. Jan Karski. A Polish resistance fighter, Karski infiltrated Nazi camps to witness the atrocities firsthand and later provided a detailed report to Allied leaders. Disguised as a guard, Karski entered the Warsaw Ghetto and a transit camp near Belzec, risking his life to gather information. He escaped to London and then to the United States, where he met with top officials, including President Roosevelt, to describe the systematic extermination of Jews. Karski's reports were some of the earliest detailed accounts of the Holocaust received by the Allies, though they struggled to grasp the full scale of the genocide at that time. 4. Witold Pilecki. A Polish army officer and member of the resistance, Pilecki voluntarily allowed himself to be imprisoned at Auschwitz to gather intelligence on Nazi atrocities. Inside the camp, he organized resistance efforts, maintained a communication network, and documented the horrific conditions prisoners endured. Pilecki later escaped from Auschwitz in 1943 and wrote a report on his experiences, which was among the first and most comprehensive accounts to reach the Allies. After the war, Pilecki continued his resistance efforts against Soviet influence in Poland, and he was executed by the communist regime in 1948. 5. King Christian X of Denmark. Denmark's king became a symbol of quiet resistance against Nazi policies, leading a nation that protected its Jewish population with remarkable unity. While stories of him wearing a yellow star in solidarity are likely apocryphal, his opposition to Nazi demands inspired his people. In 1943, Danish resistance groups and ordinary citizens helped nearly all of Denmark's Jews, over 7,000 people, escape to neutral Sweden, saving them from deportation. King Christian's defiance made him a respected figure during and after the war, and Denmark's efforts stand as one of the most successful mass rescues of Jews during the Holocaust. World. Figures like Elie Wiesel, Anne Frank, and Primo Levi, through memoirs, diaries, and public lectures, helped others understand the human experience of the Holocaust. Their words offered insight into the resilience of the human spirit, while also sounding a warning about the dangers of hatred and intolerance. As time passed, museums, memorials, and education initiatives emerged to honor the victims and educate future generations. Institutions like Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial in Poland stand as solemn tributes to those who perished and as centers for Holocaust education. These sites allow visitors to bear witness to the atrocities, housing artifacts, personal belongings, and written testimonies that serve as a lasting record of the Holocaust. The legacy of the Holocaust continues to shape modern conversations about human rights, justice, and responsibility. Terms like genocide and crimes against humanity, rooted in the Nuremberg trials, have become essential in addressing atrocities around the world. The phrase, never again, has become a rallying cry for vigilance against oppression, reminding societies that genocide can only be prevented through active resistance against hatred and intolerance. For survivors, never again was a promise to future generations, a pledge to remember, to learn, and to act. The Holocaust's lessons remain as relevant today as they were in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Rising anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and prejudice underscore the need for continued vigilance. Holocaust education has become a critical tool in teaching young people about the dangers of discrimination and the importance of empathy, understanding, and respect for human dignity. In classrooms worldwide, students study the Holocaust not only to understand history but to cultivate the moral courage needed to stand against hatred. Memorial ceremonies, such as Holocaust Remembrance Day, remind the world of the importance of honoring the memories of those who perished and those who survived. Survivors and their families gather to light candles, read names, and share stories, passing down a legacy that insists on remembrance. For them, the Holocaust is not just history. It is a personal tragedy, a wound that will never fully heal but must never be forgotten. The aftermath of the Holocaust is one of profound loss but also of resilience. Those who survived carried forward the memories of their loved ones and the communities that were erased, becoming witnesses to a truth that the world must never forget. The Holocaust's legacy is a call to humanity, a reminder that the values of justice, tolerance, and compassion are not just ideals but necessities. It is a call to remember the past, honor the memories of those who were lost, and safeguard the future against the forces of hatred. Through memorials, education, and the unwavering testimonies of survivors, we ensure that the Holocaust is remembered not just as a chapter in history but as a moral imperative for all people. The world is bound by the responsibility to honor the victims by building a future free from the atrocities they endured. The scars of the Holocaust remind us of what humanity must stand against, while the resilience of its survivors reminds us of what humanity is capable of when it chooses compassion over cruelty. The Holocaust serves as a grave warning of the consequences of hatred and intolerance. Remembering these atrocities is not just an act of history, it's a moral imperative for all of us. By honoring the memory of those who suffered and perished, we reaffirm our commitment to resist the forces of hate, fear, and division that persist in our world today. As we reflect on these lessons, we must take action to ensure that such horrors never happen again. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can spread awareness and foster a culture of understanding and compassion. Join us in keeping the memory alive, and let's work together to create a better future for all.